My name is Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR, and it is my pleasure to welcome you back to, or welcome you to, the 2023 Scholar Colloquia series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to just cover a couple of announcements. Firstly, thank you to our sponsors, and in particular, Trish Foshi. Thank you for your support of this lecture series. Trish is joining us today. And thanks to the Palahamo Foundation, to the Wenner-Gren Foundation, to Thornburg Investments, to Dan Marions, and of course to the Mellon Foundation for their support of this program. Next week we have another colloquium presentation, and that will be Margot Fitoussi with a talk about Jewish Muslim relations in Tunisia. And then we'll have a break for the American Anthropology Conference in Toronto and for Thanksgiving. So our next talk will be not until the end of November. Today's talk is being broadcast both live in person, of course, and then it's a webinar. So I will be taking questions. Those of you who are joining us online, please, if you have questions during the talk, please type those into the Q&A field, and we will alternate taking questions after the event from the live audience and the online audience. I will read out online questions. There are times when I get two similar questions, and I may combine them, so apologies in advance if I don't precisely answer a question that you've submitted. Today's speaker is Dr. Alberto Wilson, and he did his bachelor's degree at Vassar College, his PhD at the University of Houston. He was a visiting professor at Wichita State University when he applied, and since the time of application for this fellowship, he has landed a permanent job at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. So I'm very excited to hear what Alberto will be speaking about today. His topic is titled Pan American City, Work and Community in Ciudad Juárez, 1945 to 1994. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alberto Wilson.
Thank you, Dr. Ryer, for those kind words, and thank you everyone in attendance, both in person and online. I would like to thank Dr. Bill Mayer and Dean Sonia Watson at TCU for accommodating this fellowship, as this should have been my first year in Fort Worth, but I'm instead in Santa Fe. I would also like to thank the staff at SAR, from administration and library services to buildings and grounds, for making this such a great place to work. I really look forward to the next 7 months. Today, I will be presenting on my manuscript, Pan American City, providing a general overview of the questions it pursues and the significance of its findings, as well as a portion of the chapter that I have been working on and plan to complete by the end of the month. I look forward to the discussion and Q&A to follow, and without further ado, I'd like to begin with a historical snippet. Ciudad Juárez's municipal authorities were none too pleased when they discovered the pamphlets circulated by the Frente Único de Colonias Populares, the United Front of Poor Settlements, or the FUCP, calling an assembly for June 21st, 1964. It was already hot for the first day of summer, with the temperature expected to top off at 98 degrees Fahrenheit. For Mayor Aureliano González Vargas, that seemed mild in comparison to the anger of Colonia residents across the city. Daily, letters both typed and handwritten came through González's desk, enumerating the many ills faced by those residents, and many were glad to blame the situation, quote, on the incompetence of the municipal presidency and its council. Admittedly, González did not want to be the mayor. A lawyer by training, he had made a small fortune carrying out quickie divorces in Ciudad Juárez, and in 1962 joined the administration of Félix Lugo as a regidor, an assemblyman. It was a spoils position, and the pecuniary gain outstripped the obligations. But in January of 1964, after a corruption scandal and pressure from business groups, Alfonso stepped aside and González assumed the mayorship of a city of discontent residents. Few people irked Mayor González more than the leader of the FUCP, Eva Alicia López, a lideresa, a woman colonial leader. López had been involved in the cause of securing legal tenure for squatter settlements since the mid-1950s. With their power base in the colonia Emiliano Zapata, which is that one right there, López and the FUCP counted members in 9 additional settlements: Mariano Escobedo, Paso del Norte, Vicente Guerrero, Ricardo Flores Magón, Insurgentes, Josefa Ortiz de Domínguez, Constitución, Kilómetro 5, and Adolfo López Mateos. I don't know where they all are, but those are the flags. Set to meet, quote, at the usual place, González dispatched an undercover police officer to the assembly. And this is the image of the assembly. This is Eva Alicia López right here. At 12:15 p.m. in a dry, barren lot in the Colonia Zapata, López called the assembly to order from a wooden dais flanked by the FUCP's lawyer, this individual, and a representative from Mexico's Secretaría de Patrimonio Nacional, the Ministry of National Patrimony, this individual. Most assembled hid from the sun under hats and umbrellas, as the lone tree still in its infancy offered a good metaphor for the colonia itself. Enterprising individuals offered refreshments near the back of the crowd. Per the police report, and it's this one, the FUCP sought to discredit the municipality's involvement in legal tenure regularization, arguing the federal government held sole purview over clarifying which portions of the squatted territory were public land, which were privately held, and to expropriate the latter. Any involvement on the part of the municipality, the FUCP argued, would favor landholders, encourage speculation, and potentially lead to evictions. As residents from the 10 colonias took their turn speaking, the assembly got chippy. Eva Alicia López had the final word and cut into Mayor González, calling him, quote, a liar, suggesting he had swindled funds sent by the federal government, and mentioning the pressure campaign against the FUCP and López. Quote, Mr. Aureliano González Vargas has done nothing for the colonias populares, and we do not recognize the legality with which the municipality is acting, for the federal government has not officially granted purview to local officials. With emotions running high, López called the meeting to an end, quote, because the sun is beating down, and received permission to travel to Mexico City to meet with federal officials. The following day, and that's this document, on June 22nd, 1964, González sent a 2-page telegram to Eduardo Bustamante, the Minister of National Patrimony, to denounce his representative for going along, quote, with Eva Alicia López and disorienting and imperiling the actions taken by the municipality. It was clear Mayor González faced an urban insurgency on the part of the working poor. The June 21st Assembly police report, the flyer, the telegram, and the 2 photographs were housed in the Ciudad Juárez's municipal archive amidst thousands of files containing demographic information on the people who in the 1960s squatted on undeveloped, marginal land in the city's periphery and began a political movement to secure legal sanction for their lots and homes. Stuffed in the middle of those administrative files, the intention appeared to be to silence the FUCP and its leader, Eva Alicia López, and position the municipality as the patron of Ciudad Juárez's colonias, a paternal entity granting land to its rural migrant children. Yet the police report made clear the municipality and Mayor González feared the FUCP. The flyer and the photographs made clear the poor did assemble, and all made clear of Eva Alicia López's leadership. Who was Eva Alicia López, and what causes did the FUCP mobilize? What relationship did the FUCP have to organized and unorganized colonia residents? How did participation in the FUCP transform the political ideas and identities of colonia residents? What change, if any, did the FUCP have on the course of local politics? And lastly, the question I'd really like for you all to consider with me is, can the FUCP and Eva Alicia Lopez serve as a starting point for a story on the second industrialization of the U.S. Mexico border. Pan American City combines social history and political economy to explore the lived experience of Ciudad Juárez's working poor during the second industrialization of the U.S. Mexico border, that is, with the introduction and consolidation of maquiladoras. The manuscript moves along two bisecting planes. The first, to think of the working poor as political actors that made urban and labor history. And second, to revise the explanation of the maquiladora's arrival and maturation on the U.S. Mexico border. That dual focus on lived experience and economy can be summarized as an intent to tell the history of political economy from the streets. Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, Mexico's northern border city with El Paso, Texas, is the primary site of the study because of the importance the city gained as an export manufacturing zone during the global economic restructuring of the 1970s, collectively referred to as neoliberalism. Throughout, the manuscript intends to explain those political and economic shifts while not losing sight of the working poor, their sites of employment, rest and leisure, their politics and protest, and their pain. Definitions are in order. Even as neoliberalism has become zeitgeist, grasping what is meant by the term can be difficult. We might begin with geographer David Harvey's definition, which is, quote, a theory of political economic practices that proposes human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. That is, mobile capital and a state minimally involved in managing economic life. In addition to the discussion over the definition of neoliberalism, two equally important questions arise concerning the when and the how. When did neoliberalism begin, which is a question of periodization, and how did it take shape, which is a question of place and politics. For Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, a good starting point to discuss when and how of neoliberalism at the U.S. Mexico border might be 1965 with Mexico's Programa de Industrialización Fronteriza, the Border Industrialization Program. I'm going to use the Spanish PIF. The story may be familiar to those in attendance. By the mid-1960s, and I'm going to hit some gritty economic data, so bear with me. By the mid-1960s, Mexico's top economic planners noted import substitution industrialization, whereby Mexico industrialized via the protection of national industries with the use of tariffs and fiscal incentives, had begun to slow. Further manufacturing required expensive technology, while domestic demand had begun to taper. Less Mexicans were entering the middle class. Worryingly, the economic slowdown occurred as Mexico's labor market ballooned due to a growing population and the declining availability of productive rural land, which sent millions into cities. There, migrants faced tight occupational structures that entrenched poverty and sent thousands across the border to the United States. The safety valve that international migration offered Mexico, however, closed in 1964 as the United States ended the World War II-era Bracero program. The potential loss of remittances from the U.S., coupled with meek economic projections in the near run, imperiled the Mexican state's ability to meet foreign debt obligations that had funded mass-scale infrastructural programs. Paying debt with national reserves placed downward pressure on the Mexican peso, which since 1954 had stood at $12.50 per $1 and stood as a public sign of the nation's sound economy, an honorable place between the first and the third world. In short, the Mexican state and the ruling Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI, faced a potential economic and political crisis in the mid-1960s. Fortuitously, the United States government changed its tariff schedule for 1965, allowing foreign manufactured goods made with U.S. parts and components to re-enter the United States duty-free. Nearshoring, as the term has come to be referred, offered an answer to the economic perplexities faced by the Mexican state and the PRI. First, The opportunity to industrialize the northern border could help link the far-flung region to the nation's center, stimulating regional development and strengthening national economic growth projections. Second, the industrial parks required to attract foreign industry would initially lead to an increase in construction jobs made available to returning braceros, who, it was believed, would likely remain in border cities. After the initial phase of construction, these laborers could graduate into manufacturing employment. Third, the relocation of industry to Mexico's northern border would help bolster U.S. dollar foreign reserves. The maquiladora, in turn, could incentivize domestic manufacturing by generating backward linkages for inputs that Mexican firms could fulfill, thus making the purchase of expensive technology tenable for industrialists. It was, in summary, industrialization on the cheap, with the only requirement for Mexico was to offer its productivity cheaply. Hence, in 1965, under President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, Mexico began the PIF that allowed industry to relocate and manufacture for export and only pay export duties on the value added, that is, the labor that went into these products. Okay, let's go back. A focus on the PIF is a good start because it checks many of the boxes in Harvey's definition of neoliberalism. In Ciudad Juárez, the Mexican state was not committed to a state-building project along the lines of import substitution, pursuing aggressive economic planning and management to incentivize industrialization, development, and growth. Moreover, the need to maintain low wages, key to the locational factors the city offered industry, required the state not encourage nor permit unionization or any meaningful social provision. Residents in Ciudad Juárez were being introduced into factory work without any of the legal protections and legal protections on labor characteristic of post-World War II welfare states in the North Atlantic, the U.S., France, Britain, or the developmental states of the Americas, Mexico, Colombia. Instead, the Mexican government undertook legal reforms that provided the mechanisms and protections for North American industry to relocate to the Mexican border, easing the process of the importation of technology, streamlining exportation of finished goods, providing tax abatements, and turning a blind eye towards management labor issues. Importantly, the Mexican state in Ciudad Juárez did not shrink or grow smaller. Indeed, to the extent that the state had any meaningful presence in the border in the early 1960s is very questionable. Instead, as historian Elizabeth Shermer writes, quote, the modern era's political divide never rested on the false dichotomy between statism and anti-statism, but depended on how state power was deployed, who the state was intended to serve, and what types of policies the state was pursuing or curtailing. The above narration, although important, omits a major aspect of the arrival of the maquiladora on the U.S. Mexico border. By beginning the story of the second industrialization of the U.S. Mexico border with the PIF, the story is extricated from the context of the border cities of Ciudad Juárez and El Paso. Neoliberalism was thought of and signed into effect in Mexico City and faraway Washington, D.C., and then arrived on the border. Except the urban context complemented the bureaucratic and legalistic aspects that facilitated the introduction of the maquiladora. For all the fanfare surrounding the 1965 PIF, the policy itself built on the Programa Nacional Fronterizo, the National Border Program, PRONAF, that had been in operation since 1961. That policy had invested 114 million, right there, 114 million Mexican pesos in capital improvements for Ciudad Juárez, in addition to investments in social, cultural, and health amenities. Juárez received 1/4 of the entire budget of 411 million pesos. A portion of the money funded the creation of the city's first industrial park, fully equipped with water, electric, gas, and drainage connections, in addition to funding a study on the viability of export manufacturing by the U.S. consultancy firm Arthur D. Little. The PRONAF also provided industrial subsidies, tax abatements, and reduced freight rates to industry looking to relocate to the northern Mexican border. PRONAF promotional literature, and this would have been one of them circulated in 1961, made clear the state's involvement in opening new markets. Quote, to achieve its objective, the National Border Program will purchase land, construct commercial buildings, trace open spaces, public parks and gardens, operate, lease out, or sell outright the land and the structures which are the property of the state, properly channel financing, and offer attractive incentives. The PIF in 1965 brought coherence to these different policy measures, but of greater importance was the people the PRONAF brought together. Beginning in 1961, and here's an image. Ciudad Juárez and El Paso, businessmen and political elites, U.S. consultancy firms, high-level economic planners, U.S. legal firms, Mexican land developers, and free trade ideologues. And for those of you who might have familiarity with the U.S. military, that would have been the commanding officer of Fort Bliss in 1968. This pro-growth coalition of urban and bureaucratic actors, as early as 1961, were already considering the how of utilizing the state to economically transform Ciudad Juárez and the border writ large, but not in the mold of the welfare or developmental state. Returning to Harvey's definition, by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills, and within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free market, and free trade. And what they're celebrating here is in late 1968, laying the foundation to what will become the RCA, the Radio Corporation of America's massive maquiladora. It will become the largest maquiladora in the world into the 70s and 80s. Importantly, land developers, businessmen, etc. I believe, if I'm not wrong, this is the El Paso National Bank president. I might be wrong, but I believe it is. The PIF brought coherence to these different policy measures, but I already read that. Okay, actually, yeah, with him. Sam D. Young, Jr., the president of the El Paso National Bank, noted about the PRONAF and the PIF, we watch with interest, and in many cases, we assist in the studies of feasibility of establishing processing plants in Juárez under the Mexican Program for Northern Border Development. We believe this program for twin plants has great promise and potential for El Paso, for the Southwest, for Mexico, if we do not meet with insurmountable opposition within the United States. The opposition would have been the AFL-CIO and labor unions. And you can begin to see why I used Pan American City as the title of the text. Juárez was offering a solution to neoliberal capital towards this 1970s. The significance of the PRONAF and the PIF is not that these reperiodize in any substantial way the introduction of neoliberalism or the maquiladoras along the U.S. Mexico border. It would take the relocation of the RCA to Ciudad Juárez in 1968, 7 years after the start of the PRONAF, for the practical effects of the program to take off. Moreover, Ciudad Juárez's industrial base would expand fastest during the economic crisis of the 1970s and the 1980s, which made relocating to Mexico cheap and safe. Rather, the significance of the PRONAF is that it does not remove the urban context from the discussion of neoliberal statecraft, instead revealing the intricate web of thought and personal relations that composed the pro-growth coalition, which spanned the cities of Ciudad Juárez and El Paso, and linked these to Mexico City, Washington, D.C., New York City, Chicago, the industrial belt of the Midwest, and later in the century, Japan, Germany, Sweden. Accounting for the PRONAF and the coalition of free market export-oriented proponents, the individuals here, however, I must admit, leaves a very unsatisfactory narrative. Industrious men transformed a small town in Mexico's northern border into an economic juggernaut. Such a story becomes, as historian Amy Offner writes, quote, the mirror image of policymakers and businessmen's triumphalist accounts of their own careers. In the case of Ciudad Juárez, businessmen, especially land developers, become the normative urban historical actor, and the working poor only appear after the arrival of the maquiladora. That is, the working poor become historical actors only once they can be readily exploited. Such makes for an analytically expedient argument for those with political opposition to the maquiladoras, but it makes for very poor history. If the PRONAF and the pro-growth coalition of businessmen and bureaucrats of the 1960s paved the way for the border industrialization of the 1970s, Can a similar story be recreated for the urban poor? Put differently, were the urban poor present in 1961, 62, 62, 3, etc.? And more important than simply being present, were the urban poor, like the business coalition, militant? To return to a question from the opening historical snippet, can the FUCP and Eva Alicia Lopez serve as a starting point on the story of the second industrialization of the U.S. Mexico border? To tell that story of Ciudad Juárez's working poor, their politics and their protests, their communities and sites of work, Pan American City inverts the triumphalist narrative of neoliberalism, beginning with the urban poor of Ciudad Juárez, accounting for the pro-growth coalition and the policy changes that turned the city into an export manufacturing zone, and then returning to the challenges the working poor waged in their communities and their work sites against the maquiladora and neoliberalism. And I made this because this is how I'm thinking about the structure of the book, something that begins in the micro, moves up to the macro, then moves back down to the micro. To the extent that I can get away with 8 chapters on my first book, well, we will see. For the remainder of the talk, I would like to present portions of the chapter that I've been working on here at SAR and do a bit of world building, or colonia building. This is a map of Ciudad Juárez. Took it off of Google Maps. The squatter settlements of Ciudad Juárez's western mountainous periphery were difficult places to inhabit. Collectively referred to as colonias proletarias, these settlements replicated the post-World War II rural-to-city migration that turned Latin America into the most urbanized region of the world, with cities marred by deep poverty, marginalization, health disparities, and violence. Ciudad Juárez's colonias lacked municipal services, including water, electricity, gas, and drainage. Contrast that to the industrial park created by the state. Often occupied land with unclear legal status, and many lacked educational facilities. And in the case of Ciudad Juárez, the spatial division, if you can see it here, this is the Sierra de Ciudad Juárez, and the hills extend, I guess it would be in a northeasterly direction. And the Rio Grande, eons past, had carved an escarpment that roughly moves at a 45-degree angle, whereby the hills begin to the west and to the south, and the fertile agricultural valley extended to the east of that particular escarpment. And you can actually see here on Google Maps how the urban grid laid itself upon a very hilly terrain. Despite the cutting poverty and marginalizations, I love this map, and also the fact that arroyos ran right through people's lots. Colonias initially defied experts' expectations, both in government and in the academy, because they appeared to improve over time. As the initial rural migrant generation became settled, found better employment, and their children incorporated into city life, colonias improved, going from initial irregular settlements with shoddy housing structures to lined streets with brick and mortar shelter. Poverty, and perhaps more so marginalization, remained. But the life of the colonia appeared to contradict the experience of the urban ghettos in the United States, leading many of these to consider them slums of hope. And for the anthropologists, I think you might be familiar with that literature from the 1970s. For the case of Ciudad Juárez, the boxes where the FUCP files hold thousands of land adjudication claims. In the early 1960s, as the municipality and federal government began the regularization of land claims in the western colonias, residents began an adjudication process that involved signing an initial contract that stated the individual's name, age, gender, provenance, employment, and civil status, and included the measurement of the lot and the price per square meter. Colonia residents then began payment, with most coming due within 1 to 2 years, but with some extraordinary cases of adjudication cases lasting up to 10 or even more years. Following the final payment, the municipality issued a receipt, and it would have been this one, that residents held onto until their specific colonia was due for titling. Some files, in the best of cases, included a socio-economic profile of the individual who would own the lot and of their family when appropriate. I compiled a data set of 1,335 complete cases of land adjudication, sometimes they're incomplete, that provide data to answer the who settled in these colonias in the 1960s. And I want to present findings on two particular aspects that I find quite interesting. It might be hard to read. I do apologize. The table got really big. Occupational structures. The land adjudication claims help recreate the occupational structure of Ciudad Juárez prior to the maquiladora. Disaggregated by gender to control for the different types of employment, men inhabited a world of pre-industrial work, itinerant and unstable agricultural labor, trades, low-pay service jobs, and very few professional or industrial outfits. And you can see some trades here are quite awesome. Artisans, bakers, barbers, blacksmiths, a boxer, brickmaker, butchers, carpenters, cobblers, musicians, painters, photographers, printers, tailors, tanners, and watchmakers. The world that doesn't really exist anymore. I was making a comeback on Instagram. Of the 717 cases involving men, 41% listed day labor. 32% worked in the service sector that included small-scale commerce and restaurants. The city was still receiving quite a bit of North American tourists. 12% were tradesmen, and only 15 men could be classified as being professionals, with 9 being either military or police. The key takeaway being that economic security and stability, that is a constant paycheck, were at a very high premium. In terms of wages, although Ciudad Juárez had higher wages than the national average, the high incidence of US dollars in the local economy meant inflation remained a constant that raised the cost of living. I have listed the median incomes for each employment type, and these range from 200 pesos to 1,000 pesos a month, which roughly translates to about 16 to 80 US dollars a month. And a high of 7,000 pesos by a miner, which I am fairly certain he must have worked either in New Mexico or in Arizona. It's an extreme outlier in that case. Women also inhabited a world of precarious work, although much of their time was consumed by productive and reproductive work. Of the 621 cases involving women lot owners, 513 listed home as their primary employment. That is 82%. The second most common employment for women was domestic work, 50 of 621, of which most probably worked in El Paso, and listed a median income of 250 pesos, which amounted to 20 US dollars a month. Unlike men, it is likely that for women, the line between productive and reproductive work was fuzzy at best, and most entered and exited the labor market according to their and their families' needs. It was common to find initial contracts listing women as being in the home and a socioeconomic profile listing a wage or a salary, indicating that women fulfilled domestic familial and tasks and also at times took in laundry, cooking, and cleaning for other residents. Despite the differences in type of employment and the gendered relationship to productive work, in the instances where men and women worked, except for domestic tasks, there was not a large disparity in wages. In general, overall family income was depressed and did not display the gender and racial hierarchies present in industrial employment. Some differences, but not what one would expect. The second that I find quite fascinating is, where did people come from? The land adjudication claims also provide insight into the migratory paths followed by those that established themselves in Ciudad Juárez. Rural Chihuahua topped the list, accounting for 348 residents, followed by Durango with 293 and Zacatecas with 259. The 3 northern states accounted for 67% of cases. Interestingly, Ciudad Juárez natives came in 4th place, accounting for only 111 of the 1,335, and the city's hinterland, Distrito Bravos, only added 14 more. From there, practically every state sent rural migrants to the border city. Coahuila, Jalisco, Guanajuato, Aguascalientes, San Luis Potosí, Mexico City, Michoacán, Tamaulipas, Sinaloa, Veracruz, Nuevo León, Sonora, Mexico State, Yucatan, Nayarit, Hidalgo, Baja California, Guerrero, Querétaro, Morelos, and Texas and Arizona. Ciudad Juárez was a city of immigrants. The geographic distribution makes clear 2 points that I think are relevant. First, Ciudad Juárez became an important receptacle for rural migrants from Mexico's central northern region, especially from the area of La Laguna around Coahuila and Durango, where export-based agriculture, especially in cotton and wheat, had displaced thousands of individuals. Despite the economic precarity most encountered upon entering the city's occupational structure, Ciudad Juárez still offered enough places of employment to make the city attractive. Second, although the city provided possible entry into El Paso and the United States, I remain very hesitant in overstating the attraction of the United States for these migrants. Ciudad Juárez and El Paso served as the main entry and exit points for the braceros from 1942 to 1964, and undoubtedly many decided to settle in Ciudad Juárez after their time in the U.S. Additionally, unsanctioned migration continued to move through Ciudad Juárez with or without a bracero program. However, upon close inspection, the states that sent the most braceros, Michoacán, Jalisco, and adjoining states, do not appear with the frequency one would expect to find given the scholarly literature's focus on push-pull factors. A minor but relevant point, but one that I believe needs to be stated: rural migrants wanted to live in Ciudad Juárez. And with that, let's return to Eva Alicia López. Gregorio Ramos Ortiz owned 55 hectares of land in Ciudad Juárez's western districts, and in October of 1957 received approval from the city council to subdivide his land and sell lots. Private landowners had begun to partition their land and offer lots in the 1950s, primarily catering to an upper middle income residents looking to relocate from the city center. The practice worked well in the eastern periphery, where legal tenure was secure and the land sufficiently amenable. But no private landholder, except for Ramos, thought to subdivide his property in the western hills. After receiving approval, Ramos shifted his profits from a milk pasteurization plant into his land development plans and managed to grade and level 7 hectares before running into financial difficulties. Development in the hilly terrain, turns out, was very costly, and his subdivision only attracted low-income individuals priced out of the city center and the agricultural valley. Within a year, in 1958, Ramos entered bankruptcy and only managed to save his assets by incurring a lien on his property by an undisclosed party. Ramos attempted once again to jumpstart his profit scheme in November of '59, but, quote, settlers created the Colonia Emiliano Zapata, suspended their payments, and began arguing that my land was part of the public domain. The residents of the newly founded Colonia Zapata were led by Eva Alicia López. Eva Alicia López was among the approximately 300,000 residents that squatted on land in the western periphery of Ciudad Juárez in the 60s. López, quote, gained strength, tomó fuerza. According to a secret police report, in November of 1959, with the inauguration of Humberto Escobar as Ciudad Juárez's municipal president, the secret police report mistakenly placed the wrong date. It's 59, not 57. With a strong performance in the 1959 local elections by the opposition party, the National Action Party, the PAN, Escobar of the PRI began to court Colonia residents into the party's political base. Quote, the party is dedicated to reorganizing its structure in the city, read another secret police report on Chihuahuan politics, with the objective of not losing contact with the people after a disagreeable experience during the previous campaign for municipal president. Noting the political leverage that Colonia residents had in municipal politics, López led the occupation of Gregorio Ramos Ortiz's property. 1 year later, in December of 1960, Mexican President Adolfo López Mateos issued a presidential decree that devolved 11 square miles of federal public land to the state of Chihuahua that would in turn be used to expand the city's limits, Ciudad Juárez's limits. The decree became fundamental to the politics of the urban poor and Eva Alicia López and served as the origin story these residents told of their communities. The decree justified the transfer of land based on Ciudad Juárez's urban poor, quote, and the numerous destitute colonia proletarias that lack the most elementary services necessary for proper hygiene and health. Paternalism notwithstanding, the Mexican decree called into question the private property rights of individuals that claimed holding in the ceded area using the phrasing presumptive properties or a combination thereof 6 times. Stopping short of an outright expropriation, which would have affirmed the land's private character, the 1960 presidential decree was clear the 11 square miles had, quote, not left the domain of the nation, and even if they had, their social use, quote, to satisfy the housing needs of the economically weak classes outweighed any individual's right to hold and dispose of the property. The text of the presidential decree likely made Ramos shudder. Lopez understood the subtext of the decree, did not abrogate private property rights, but did gesture that the social use of property superseded individual claims. Lopez began organizing Colonia Zapata residents and in October of 1961 traveled to Mexico City to meet with Leon Garcia, head of the complaints office for the office of the presidency, and returned to Ciudad Juárez with the guarantee that the federal government would investigate the competing land claims. Angered, Ramos wrote a letter to Garcia lambasting the public official for granting Lopez an audience that made her, quote, fiend being and influential. It was, quote, the leaders of these colonias, wrote Ramos, especially Eva Alicia Lopez, who have led an agitational campaign based on lies, stealing from people with few resources. Ramos was correct in noting Lopez's adept ability to play different public officials and levels of government off one another to stall regularization. Quote, the President of the Republic ceded land for the expansion of the city's limits, removing them from private hands, wrote Lopez. Who do we pay, sir? Mr. Jesus Silva, Gregorio Ramos Ortiz, Mrs. Carmen Arroyo, or the municipality? We believe the municipality is who can legally grant property deeds. Stalling, however, was not due to Lopez's ulterior motives, as Ramos noted ad nauseum. Quote, if we consider these leaders control 20,000 residents, with each being swindled 500 pesos, that is 10 million pesos, which explains their reasons to exploit squatters, seeing the issue remain unresolved with the help of well-intentioned but misinformed public officials. Ramos had no interest in admitting colonia residents. We're not passively expecting Eva Alicia Lopez or any other colonia leader to solve their problems, but rather we're organized into many groups, some more and other less politically confrontative. Rather, the stalling tactics employed by Lopez were due to the inauguration of a new municipal administration in 1962, led by figures far less concerned with the plight of the urban poor. With growing presence in additional colonias, the FUCP shifted their political tactics away from positing the municipality as the legal guarantor of property deeds to agitating for the federal government to intervene directly in the matter. It was an astute tactic, as Lopez understood the calls for federal intervention would be very hard to ignore after Mexico and the United States agreed to finally resolve the issue of the chamizal, that is the century-long border dispute in the cities of El Paso and Ciudad Juárez. And with celebrations planned for 1964, the Mexican government did intervene. In mid-1963, a presidential decree created the Comisión Mixta de Regularización y Planeación de las Colonias Populares. I'm going to call it the commission. That included public servants from the federal, state, and local level. More than a simple mechanism for the resolution of legal tenure dispute, the commission sought, quote, an integral solution that included land regularization, but was not limited by it. The Minister of National Patrimony, Eduardo Bustamante, suggested that municipal services be extended to the 17 colonia, quote, problem zone, in addition to extending low service loans to squatters to build or beautify their homes. In short, wrote the minister, granting each settler land and home in conditions attainable given their economic situation. The commission shifted the political terrain against Ramos, who wrote a letter to President Lopez Mateos denouncing the, quote, partiality demonstrated towards the urban poor. Quote, the only explanation for the actions taken by these public officials expounded Ramos, my apologies, is the wish to appease squatters and count with their support in future elections. Mayor González Vargas, however, had no interest in cajoling colonial residents to the PRI. In a secret memorandum circulated among municipal officials, Vargas made clear his discontent with the commission and the mobilization of the FUCP, stating the issue of land regularization, quote, will anger those residents that have lived within the law and who look down on rewarding squatters. By early summer 1964, with the commission's work finalizing and favoring colonial residents, Mayor González looking to stymie those advancements, Eva Alicia Lopez called the FUCP to assemble, looking to continue the organizing energy into late summer when President López Mateos would visit Ciudad Juárez for the Chamizal celebrations. And that's where we started today, with the June 21st, 1964 assembly. In the end, this is another secret police report. In the end, Eva Alicia Lopez met President López Mateos in September 1964 on the night prior to his meeting with President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And in December of 1964, Aureliano González Vargas stepped down from the municipal presidency, leading to an interim appointment. The following year, in 1965, Armando González Soto, a close ally to the FUCP and Eva Alicia Lopez, was elected municipal president, and his administration took the work of the commission and between 1965 and 1968 regularized the legal tenure of most of the city's colonias. Following the election of González Soto and a pro-pros to where we are today, Eva Alicia Lopez retired from the FUCP, started a family, and settled in New Mexico. The experience in collective self-management and the participatory community-based structures of representation and decision-making that occurred in the colonias of Ciudad Juárez, especially within the FUCP, make clear the working poor existed adjacent to and in opposition to the pro-growth coalition brought together by the PRONAF and the PIF. Notwithstanding the immediacy of their aims, forestalling eviction, securing favorable prices, and regularizing lot claims, the FUCP developed a political program that included a critique of municipal governance and foregrounded poor people's rights to the city. Not all colonia and residents agreed with the FUCP, as some colonias and their organizations demobilized after the objective of land regularization was met. The FUCP's 10 colonias, however, were in very distinct phases of regularization, from surveying to titling, and members of the organization and their leader, Lopez, hoped to use that experience to build a larger squatter settlement movement. It would, to be frank, remain unfulfilled for much of the 1960s. But what is striking about the FUCP is that the articulation of the problem, poor people's right to a home, municipal services, education, based on self-management, foreshadow the social movements of the 1970s rather than those of the 1960s. There is little of the global 60s in the actions and thought of the FUCP. Eva Alicia Lopez was neither a student, a worker, a religious leader, a civil rights activist, or an anti-colonial leader, or any other archetype of protest during that decade. Those social movements bookend a period that had begun with the Great Depression and the popular front governments of the 30s and had matured into the 1960 welfare and developmental states. Whether African Americans in the US or students in Mexico City, those social movements attempted to pry open the doors of the Rooseveltian coalition or of the PRI, still believing, quote, in the system. By the 1970s, however, Vietnam and massacres had led to disillusionment, leading to new radical articulations of the Third World, Black Power, Maoist guerrillas, and poor people's movements. If, as philosopher Michael Hart suggests, the 1970s, quote, constitute a first assay to confront neoliberal capitalism, what of the FUCP in the 1960s echoes what will come in the 1970s? There is a striking similarity between the FUCP's experiment in self-management and the takeover of factories in Italy and the countryside in Chile during the 1970s and their calls for autonomy. The FUCP's reading of the 1960 presidential decree noted the aperture to making a social use argument against the right of private property. It did so, to be sure, did not, to be sure, call for communal use of land. Every resident still received their personal lot of land. But the private-public dyad represents a false dichotomy, for the FUCP was not looking to transfer the land to the state. Rather, and here once again borrowing from Hart, the property relations are radically transformed by participatory democratic institutions of collective self-management. This, Hart suggests, can better be understood as the creation of a common, a form of social property not of the state, but grounded in local autonomous efforts. Indeed, into the 1970s, a more forceful articulation, and you have a photograph of that here, of collective self-management arose in the colonias through the Comité de Defensa Popular, and you can see their emblem right there, which linked the exploitation in the maquilas to the marginalization in the colonias and sought through education, protests, electoral politics, and further land invasions to create a proletarian critique of the city and capitalism. In that, like in the FUCP, women played a key role. Another of the echoes that extends from Eva Alicia Lopez in the 1960s to the greater politicization of women in the 1970s. As noted, half of all lot owners in the colonias were women, and their organizing work, in addition to their productive and reproductive labor, sustained these communities. Lastly, the ability to write Eva Alicia Lopez, the FUCP, and the colonias of Western Ciudad Juárez challenged the triumphalist narrative of neoliberalism, displacing the normative figure of the city's history and placing the businessmen and bureaucrats in relation to and in opposition to the working poor. The right to the city that emanated from the colonias and their organizations also preempted the need to think of the relationship urban residents have to the city in their access to housing, employment, municipal services, public spaces, parks, and cultural amenities. That, I believe, remains significant, especially as contemporary cities grow ever more expensive with privatization, speculative, and policing schemes that shut out ever more people from obtaining the necessities and also enjoying the bounty of urban life. Thank you.
If I could remind our online audience to please add any questions. We have some that have come in, but please type your questions into the Q&A field, not the chat field, the Q&A field.
Yeah, Phil.
What a fantastic talk. I mean, just so interesting, particularly the sort of delinkage of what we take to be the familiar story of the critique of the proletarianization of this with the rise of the colonia as a kind of spatial, kind of place which the proletariat can only occupy, right? I mean, the prehistory of this is just so interesting. I was really struck at this moment where Ramos, private landholder, is going to subdivide his land, which leads to a sort of conflictual situation in which the appeal goes to, if I'm understanding it right, the federal level, and a presidential proclamation that seems to back into a kind of eminent domain argument. And in the U.S. context, right, this eminent domain thing would be really sort of central. I mean, because eminent domain is really figured as a local, right, in other words, sort of municipal or state level kind of practice until the sort of mid-19th century, at which point I think there's a Supreme Court decision that says it can be a federal, federal kind of thing as well, which then opens the floodgates to reclamation in the West and all kinds of federal eminent domain sorts of seizures. So, but I just don't know the Mexican history very well, other than to know certain histories and traditions of land reallocation. I'm just wondering how federal eminent domain fits into this as a kind of, would it sit at the municipal level? Would it sit at the federal level? How does it sit in relation to this sense that we're going to create a common structure which is still going to have private lots, right, with private ownership-ish within that? So I'm just wondering if you can say a few more words about what that terrain looks like.
I don't know much about eminent domain in the Mexican context, to what extent it's a similar legal concept. But what was fascinating about the 1960 presidential decree and how it linked to Ramos's intention of subdividing his land is that Mexico had no urbanization law to sort of figure out these matters where municipal lands perhaps potentially come up against federal lands. And the decree itself was based on a 1950 agrarian law, And of course, agrarian law has massive importance in Mexico due to the revolution and the ejidos. And if you read the law, and I actually did this, urban is mentioned 3 times, and it's mentioned twice in the same article that the decree supposedly based its decision to transfer land from the state over to the municipality. Ultimately, what I gather is that the decree was sort of tossed up into the air, and seeing where it landed. Does it land with the private landholders, or does it land with Eva Alicia Lopez? And what I don't think Ramos understood, that was really the argument. The argument is who can better mobilize arguments for or against their particular position. And Eva Alicia Lopez was a phenomenal, just like house of cards political player in reading the political moment and understanding that if we can mobilize and if we can make these arguments with all the paternalism of we need help and we're economically weak, we'll be able to make the better argument for this particular use of land. In certain respects, I think Eva Alicia Lopez is perhaps paving the way towards having the state consider the fact that after World War II, it's no longer really an agrarian society, it's really an urban society. And as such, it's gonna have to figure out how to manage with all of these urban centers, case in point being Mexico City. So yeah, so it's fascinating, and I wish I could speak more about eminent domain, but what I do know is the law itself was a very poor basis for any sort of issue on urbanization.
I have an online question, if I might, that I think is great. I'll get to all of them, I hope. But this is from Christy Thornton, and I'll read her question. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I'm interested in how you understand the relation between this land regularization and neoliberalization more broadly. Are these movements against the state or against capital, or both? Brilliant research.
Well, I should say Dr. Christy Thornton from Johns Hopkins is my Mellon mentor, so thank you, Dr. Thornton, for signing on. What I think is fascinating about this is the state, through the PRONAF, is going to open land markets in Mexico, in Ciudad Juárez's eastern agricultural valley, to make it tenable for industrialists to develop that land from agricultural use to turning them into massive RCA factories. What's interesting on this side is to the extent that the state is opening markets, because it is sort of putting it up in the air, make a better argument for this land, the poor step in and say, once again, we're not necessarily opposed, we're not opposed to private property. We all want our lots, and all of the letters always listed. We have worked so hard to build up our family's patrimony, but they are still doing it in a way that it just does not fit the public-private dyad. It's a very different use of land. It's a very different conception of the relationship that the individual and the community has to that particular portion of land. So to the extent that the FUCP in the 60s is truly able to create such a conception of a critique towards land development, towards capitalism, I think is fairly handicapped. That, I think, shows much more, comes much more into the 70s, where the CDP is making very real arguments that links the exploitation of the individuals in the maquiladoras to the marginalization that they face in the colonias. That notwithstanding, there's something there, I think. There's something there. I think the FUCP and Eva Alicia Lopez is trying to sort of make sense of marginality, trying to make sense of just living in a very difficult situation, but also trying to really see themselves as how might we change the city and make it work for ourselves. So to the extent that I can answer the question, Dr. Thornton, I will continue to think about it as this is still a work in progress.
Thank you for your project. It's so rich. I love the attention to both political economy and working class history. The question I have is what is the salience of immigration and gender? It's such an incredible moment when the border industrialization program launches. It's right at the end of the Bracero program. You know, over 5 million contracts were issued to Mexican men. The border industrialization programs, as I think you said, were supposed to be like safety valve, like employ the men who are returning, but they didn't. They employed women, working class women, increasingly, as you say, rural, urban, migrant women. So what is the connection between women's labor force participation or exploitation in the maquiladoras and the rise of politicization of leaders like Eva Alicia Lopez.
Thank you. Thank you. So when I began to build the data set, I was immediately struck by the fact that there is practically near parity to the extent that men and women are owning lots. I think it is partly, in fact, due to, hey, can you go talk to the municipality and figure out a lot? I have to go work, right? So I think there's a little bit of that. I also think there's a little bit of women taking ownership of their family and saying, I'm going to go and figure out the issue with the lot, go to the municipality, scream to the mostly male public officials, and get the lot. As I also began to work through the demographic, sort of the census data, what was striking is if one puts themselves in the shoes, for instance, of the pro-growth coalition, they're not entirely wrong in immediately noticing that there's a lot of just sort of sunken labor there that's not very sort of productive. There's something there to incorporate these individuals into the maquiladoras and have them become productive. That allows women to begin to work, and I'm going to just bracket that for 1 second before going to the other thing. What I've never been able to understood is I do not disagree that the Bracero program played an important role in the border industrialization program. I'm not sure to what extent, though, because it seems to be making a very odd argument of we want all the Braceros to find work, which no one in the maquiladoras actually wants. No one would be seeking full employment. We're not working with the welfare states anymore. But we're also not going to end up employing them because we're mostly employing women. So the fact that that's always been an argument has always struck me as kind of an odd sort of causation that's going on. Now, to go back to the women, what one will find come into the 1970s is that as a lot of these women are working at the RCA and just sort of beginning to work in all these assembly lines, I think you get a dual occurrence of heavily exploited terribly, in terrible work conditions with no labor and social provisions, but you also get just simply more politicization. You get women taking far more ownership of both their labor. You get a lot of sort of the feedback, and one can also see this in Ciudad Juárez, of a lot of the sort of politicization of the Chicano movement is clearly going to play a role in just how women are conceiving themselves as political actors, not solely as actors in the domestic sphere. And I think one follows that from Eva Alicia Lopez into other of the both lideresas in the colonias and in the factories. What I do not know, and I'll just frankly say this, what I don't know is to what extent were they actually successful? And I don't know if I want to frame it as a success failure, but to what extent were they successful to take the marginality that they experienced in the colonias to alter the sort of their experience of the maquiladoras? I don't know. CDP tried, and it did, I think, do a lot. But it is interesting how disempowered people are in their workplace and how marginal they are in their lives and where they reside, and to what extent they're able to link those two. That's, I think, one of the central sort of questions of the subsequent chapters moving forward.
I wondered if the adjudication process included some consideration. Did they have to buy, or were they just given title to the land?
No, they purchased them.
They did?
They purchased them. So once again, they're not saying, give me the land. Everyone was willing to pay for it. What they did do, however, is they said, we're not going to pay what Ramos wants for it, because Ramos wants 20 pesos per square meter. We want, it was 150 for land with arroyos, 250 for hilly land without arroyos, and 4 pesos per square meter for flat land. So there's a private market there for it, and the municipality took it in, but they're also not selling it at what the private landholders want to. And that was part of the activism of the FUCP and part of the work the commission also carried out.
So now there's an active market in these properties, buy and sell?
Oddly enough, no. There's a remarkable stasis with people remaining there. And usually these properties end up becoming multi-generational homes. So they also weren't thinking about necessarily, I'm going to have this land and then leverage it to purchase another lot in the eastern agricultural valley. These places really did just become sort of proletarian communities. And one can see the structures literally, how they've been sort of hobbled together to become where families of 2, 3, but even 4 generations are living under the same roof.
Thank you.
Which also maybe is there's still poverty that's really entrenched in the colonias. I think there's also still a little bit of ownership and wanting to live here, not there.
We have another online question here. This is from Dorothy Bracy. And she writes, please expand a bit more on how you were able to get things like the secret police reports and various letters.
Oh, those are, so Mexico had two secret police agencies, the DFS and the DGIPS. For the name?
Dorothy Bracy.
For Dorothy Bracy, those are available at the National Archives in Mexico City. You can see the DGIPS archives, and that is these right here, Investigaciones Políticas y Sociales. Those are available. They're massive texts, so you're just going to have to sort of ruffle through them to find what you need. Those are available. What are more difficult to find are the DFS secret police reports. But there have been truth and, what are they called, like in South Africa, the truth commissions type of thing? Truth and reconciliation commissions that have been able to see the DFS records and have posted them online. So you can also put up DFS archive and you should be able to find a few of those.
She's got a...
Yeah, I'm struggling to understand the social aspect to private ownership because from what you said, it meets the definition the economists use for private property. So, you know, if my neighbor has a garden, so I can now jump over the fence and take the vegetables, is that the social aspect? That would violate private property. So help me understand that point.
I'm also trying to work through it, admittedly. And I recently began to read this text by Michael Hart, where I think he is trying to work through the concept of autonomy. What does autonomy mean when every family still has an individual lot, purchased a lot, pays taxes on the lot, puts up a fence saying this is mine, but yet somehow has a relationship that is very distinct from perhaps saying this is my lot, and I want to use this lot to purchase the other lot. Let me sell this one. Let me buy that one. One of the ideas that Eduardo Bustamante, the Minister of National Patrimony, had was to involve one of Mexico's developmental banks in the colonias to provide individuals with loans. Everyone said no. No one wanted it. Everyone preferred to live in difficult structures initially, but build a community later than say, I want a finished home now, and then see you later, my friends, my fellow colonia residents. So it's tricky. I think the private-public dyad still holds a lot, sort of reigns over our mind on how we're thinking about it. What I think is there's collective self-management. There is an active participation on the part of residents, and I don't want him to make it like a homeowners association suddenly, but there's active participation by colonia residents to say this is how we're going to manage our affairs. But there's also not saying, state, take it over, state, grant it to me. It's odd, right? And you know, there's a way to read this, and Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist, has said, well, what these really are, these are just capitalists in the making, right? You need to give them a title so that they can begin to act and behave and sort of leverage this in that way. I don't see it happening all that often. There's a remarkable, once again, a remarkable stasis in these colonias where the property has been held for now generations and continues to be thought of as this is mine. So working through what autonomy means, think it's part of social movements of the neoliberal kind and not what precedes it.
I personally was wondering, you know, whether some of that, what you just called oddness, might help you ultimately round out or tweak a David Harvey kind of framework. That might be a question that's premature at this point in the book, but
if I may say, I want to thank SAR because I have 3 David Harvey books sitting in my office that I'm going to settle into over winter, and I think that is the beauty of a place like this. I will be able to think about Harvey's ideas of a right to a city.
Terrific. I'll look for it. I have some more in my office if you need. Although he writes the same book over and over.
Yes.
But, I have one more question from our online audience that I want to get to. This is from Chris Chavez. Can Dr. Wilson address what occurred with the Nazi sympathizers who operated out of Ciudad Juárez leading up to and during World War II?
I'll say I'm not entirely familiar, to be quite frank. I do know there was a recent book on this published. and I'm blanking on the name, Educating the Enemy. I should get on it and read it, but I do not know much about the Nazi sympathizers in Ciudad Juárez.
If no one has another question, I've got another one. You know, I'm struck, as you said, sort of nearshoring, this kind of border, you know, kind of development. There's a weird comparative moment, right, in the late 60s where the Fairchild company, which is developing computers, comes into the Navajo reservation and basically constructs a gendered workforce in a kind of industrial thing. And it makes me think about this long history of sort of gendered workforces, right? The early French cheese and dairy industry is women, right? In New England, the sort of, you know, kind of first industrial, you know, kinds of things are women, right? These workforces. And with that has to come not just the political history and the social history, but a kind of cultural construction of a kind of working class, right, that enables women to actually be the sort of workforce. And this is exactly what happens with this Navajo case. It's like, they're so good with their fingers because of these weaving traditions, you know, so there's this whole kind of cultural infrastructure. And I'm just wondering what if there is such a thing and what that looks like as the maquila, you know, sort of like really kind of takes hold as we're thinking through the 70s and into the 80s, what the cultural work looks like.
There's, I believe, two distinct maquiladoras, the 70s and early 80s, and then post-80s maquiladoras. The 70s and 80s were hard soldering labor of just hunched over, trying to work on these chips, and the argument there was, well, women have very nimble fingers, so they should be able to solder for 12 hours at a time and then do it again for the next 6 days. So there's a lot of that construction. I know at least in El Paso, it was the same thing with the garment workers. Mexican women are very good sewing, so let's put them in the factories and then exploit them. And to the extent, and once again, it's under revision, as I've been able to think about it a little bit more, I don't know to what extent I'm actually going to push the timeline so deep into the 90s to where I would be speaking about that second maquiladora. But the one thing I do want to say, to just make clear, is after about the 80s, the maquiladoras really do change, and you really do begin to see high intelligence maquiladoras come in, where a lot of very well-educated engineers from all over Mexico and from Ciudad Juárez will begin to join the maquiladora, will begin to see themselves move up the economic ladder, and will begin to have jobs that are not necessarily just the soldering jobs of the 70s. And a lot of this will mean that the maquiladora's workforce will eventually sort of even out into the same number of men and the same number of women. That notwithstanding, in the part that I am focused with is you're still mostly dealing with women. You're mostly dealing with Eva Alicia Lopez's of the colonias, and they're being integrated into the workforce because of the supposed physical characteristics that are going to allow them to be so good at making color televisions for an American consumer society. I will, however, continue to look more. What's difficult, Phil, and what I will say, it's so hard to study the maquiladora because these records are not public. The RCA is not going to make its records public, no maquiladora. And so oftentimes what I'm sort of left with is studying the maquiladora from the communities itself. What are the residents saying about their experiences? Or digging into some of that social scientific literature from the 70s and almost taking their work as my primary source and being able to understand these places. So I'm gonna continue to try and figure out what the experience inside that maquiladora was. Oh. Yeah, of course. I think there's one in the
question. For her first.
Thank you. Is it fair, I understand, to ask a question about where this leads, given that you're at the beginning of your book? I am wondering, where does, your work is so rich, it makes one speculate about today. Where do you see these issues of autonomy and border industrialization, the thread, as it were, playing out today in multiple ways? Thank you.
Of course. I think I'm probably going to cut it off in 1986. It's almost me telling myself that. What I think is happening, one, let's take the title, Pan American City. And I admit this was a title that was suggested by a reader of the dissertation in grad school. When you look at the coalition, the pro-growth coalition, what I've referred to them as. There. That's very Pan-American, right? The commanding officer of Fort Bliss went over to Ciudad Juárez to help lay the cornerstone of the RCA factory. So if one takes Pan-Americanism, and we can take it from the 19th century, Pan-Americanism was initially perhaps an argument to say we in the Americas were part of an independence era that brought the nation state, republican governments to fruition, and old Europe was lagging because they still had a bunch of monarchies. We get the era around sort of the 1898, the Platt era in Wilson, with a Pan-Americanism that is, we, the United States, are going to sort of rule as a fiefdom over the Circum-Caribbean and much of Latin America. By the 1930s, you get a very different understanding of what Pan-Americanism is, and it's directly linked to, one, the Popular Front movements that began to come to power across the Americas, from Roosevelt to, one could call, post-revolutionary Mexico, to Uruguay, to other places, and the fascist governments in Europe. So we in the Americas continue to be very much at the forefront of political ideas. By the 60s, however, and as we began to see this moment of break with the welfare state and the post-World War II moment of affluence, Pan-Americanism suddenly becomes a very useful argument for the business coalition. Who wouldn't want free trade, right? Who doesn't want people from Ciudad Juárez and El Paso to frolic together? Who doesn't want nearshoring today? So I think that's a thread. The way that, and we saw this during the pandemic with the crisis with the chips, suddenly everyone was like, well, why don't we just set up in Mexico, right? Let's just go to Mexico, set up. Well, that's a direct continuation of the history that we've already been having since at least 1968, with the fact that if we make regional markets, and if we can sort of say that we're very proud of our regional markets, NAFTA, I think, is the sort of the jewel in the crown, suddenly we are very progressive. And there's a fascinating moment in 1968 when the INS chief, the Immigration and Naturalization chief, goes before a Senate committee and says, who doesn't want open borders? It works great in El Paso and Ciudad Juárez. Of course, 9/11 is going to change that quite a bit, but Pan-Americanism and this relationship between the United States and Mexico and this sort of industrial cooperation suddenly becomes a very progressive argument to make into NAFTA era, and then even today, which is a big thing now in Mexico, right? All of the nearshoring that we need, because the fact that the cars got so expensive and the iPhones were missing. So I think that's definitely a through line there. Of course.
You mentioned exploitation of the workers, and that's a phrase that just kind of, most people say, of course. But the assumption they're making is that the person's being exploited relative to an American worker. Mm-hmm. And that's not an option that these people have. And this comes up in the debate over child labor, because the assumption is child labor is a terrible thing. Mm-hmm. It depends what the alternative is. If it's being sold into the sex trade, maybe being a carpet worker is not so bad. So I wonder how you're thinking about this term, exploitation of workers.
The numbers indicate that since the maquiladoras have been at the border, workers at the border still make more money than their counterparts in central Mexico. And that's, I think, a fact. We can say exploitation, and we can just take, I guess, the classic Marxist calculation, which is if the product is selling for this much and the paper was paid this much, there's exploitation. Well, maybe there is some of that. What I think is the exploitation that I'm talking about is working in a maquiladora but not having social provisions. Working in a maquiladora and the state actively involved in not permitting unionization. Working in a maquiladora and then returning to a colonia that the state has still been unable to introduce municipal services, not alighting the fact that the RCA's factory is not only consuming massive amounts of water, it's probably consuming water that it's probably not even paying for in its entirety. So I think that's the exploitation that I am particularly referring to. An exploitation whereby workers, upon both their experience in the workspace and outside of it, are facing no form of state or social security. Well, I saw like a hand go semi up at some point. I don't know if I just imagined it.
I don't have any more online questions, so I think...
we have one more.
There is a hand, yes.
I'd like to ask a question about how this evolves over time. So exploitation and of one generation. Does it, are people in the colonias able to create a platform where their children will do better or that it will improve over generations? And do they think in those terms at all?
To the extent that, and I think this is also one of those very slippery conversations that we can begin to get into with the maquiladoras, because a generation or two off, the maquiladoras have worked for a lot of people. There is a lot of people in the colonias who are doing fairly well for themselves. There's a lot of people in the colonias who their children have been able to get an engineering degree, continue to work in the maquiladora, but at least are making a little bit more money than their parents. And yet, we still have massive entrenched poverty in the maquiladoras. We have much higher incidences of violence, drug consumption, violence against women, and not to render these places as like a very exotic other. These are still places of uplift and of strength. But I think it is something that we should probably revisit overall is just simply social scientists. What has the life of the maquiladora and the relationship to the work within the maquiladora been for a lot of these residences, a lot of these residences? My hunch would be that it's probably going in both directions. It's helped a lot, and it's also probably entrenched marginalization for quite a bit of people. I will say, trying to avoid that conversation by sticking to history. That's a difficult one.
Some of us don't have that.
Yes.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Alberto Wilson.